Amen. We are going to talk about one of my favorite stories in the Gospel of Mark, but we have to give ourselves a little bit of awareness as to our own social locations, as well as the historical context of this story. So let's establish a few things right off the bat so we can understand how this story unfolds and why we are talking about it today. First things first, in case you didn't know, this next one's going to come as a real shocker. Jesus was Jewish. And that's important to know because the way he talks to Jewish religious leaders is from a Jewish perspective, which means that Jesus also was not anti-Semitic, even though Christians have taken the teachings in the life of Jesus and used them to spew some anti-Semitic words, ideas, and actions. It's also important to know that Jesus was not against the practice of Jewish religion and culture because Jesus fully participated in Jewish religion and culture. And it's also important to note that Jesus never intended to start a correct or different religion than the one that he grew up with. He only participated within Judaism. Now, that's important to know because this story is a story about how Jesus was self-critical of his own religion. And while he offers critiques and ideas about his own religion, he does that as a participant from inside. And this self-critical critique is necessary for healthy spirituality. Without this self-critical voice, religion will become idolatrous, right? And you might end up worshiping the religion more than you end up worshiping God. Now, if we were to update the metaphor and talk about Jesus Christ being the Son of God incarnated in 2024 in America, the truth is Jesus would probably be a Christian in this world, right, and this mindset. And if Jesus lived as a Christian in America today, he would be critical of Christianity. He would critique Christianity and talk about the problems of Christianity from a person inside the Christian perspective. And while he would be self-critical of Christianity, he would still go to church and take communion and read the Bible. If Jesus was born in 2024 in Saudi Arabia, Jesus most likely would be a Muslim in Saudi Arabia. He would critique Islam from inside the religion of Islam, right? But while he was critiquing it, he would still participate by praying 5 times a day, participate in a mosque, and also make a pilgrimage. So what this means is that if we want to follow Jesus, we need to learn to be self-critical of our own religion and realize that when these teachings happen and this story unfolds from a Jewish perspective, it's offering insight into how we relate to our own religions. So with that in mind, let's go back 2,000 years ago to the great city of Jerusalem, where when Jesus was walking on this earth, there was a temple at the highest point of the city that looked something like this. Now, as we discussed last week, Jesus saw the hierarchy and social disorder that was happening at the temple, and in his rage led a riot and cleared the temple and said this was supposed to be a house for all nations. He then leaves at some point, and what most people don't know is that in the Gospel of Mark, the next day, Jesus returns right back to the temple. Now, I've never had this happen, but I imagine the equivalent would be if you were at work and someone made a big scene, started flipping over desks and say, "I quit, I hate this place, it's lousy," and the next day they show up to work like nothing happened. That's essentially the equivalent, right? So Jesus goes back to the temple after making a giant scene and saying, "Hey, this is a terrible place," and then he returns the next day. Now, this story unfolds in the court of the Gentiles, most likely, which is the blue area on the image behind me. And as Jesus returns, you can imagine there's a lot of whispers that are happening, right? And as they are whispering, a crowd begins to form around him, and the religious leaders of Jesus' day approach him, and they start to ask him a question. The question they ask him is, on what authority are you doing these things? These things being, inciting a riot at the temple. Where do you think you have the authority to say that we're in the wrong? They go on to ask, who has given you the power to do these things? Now, I have to tell you, I think this is a great question, right? It's a question that should be asked. And while I would be very upset at this person returning back to this religious structure as a leader, they are very calm and collected. And they say, hey, glad to have you back, maybe, but where do you get the idea that you can do these things and say these things? Now, Jesus hears that question, which is a great question, and returns the favor to them and says to them, I will ask you a question, only one, Jesus replied. And if you give me an answer, then I will tell you on what authority I do the things that I do. So they say, we want to ask you a question. He says, I'll answer any question you ask as long as you're willing to answer my question. The religious leaders think about it, and it seems like they agree to these terms. And so Jesus says to them, tell me, was John's baptism of divine origin or merely human? Now, if you just parachute into the Gospel of Mark at chapter 11, you will miss the entire story that's been happening, because John is actually introduced first in the Gospel of Mark before Jesus shows up on the scene. If you go back to the very first chapter, 10 chapters earlier, Mark introduces us to John the Baptist. And I want to give a bit of a review. We talked about this story at the beginning of our series in the Gospel of Mark, but John saw the social disorder and the hierarchy and the extortion of the poor that was happening at the temple, and as a Jewish person critiquing his own religion, he was enraged by it, much in the same way that Jesus was 10 chapters later. Now, rather than flipping over tables, John the Baptist had a different protest in mind, because he saw the temple charging the poor so that they could have their sins forgiven by God, and said, that doesn't seem right. And so John went from Jerusalem to the east to the Jordan River. Now, there are two major bodies of water in modern-day Israel. The one to the north is the Sea of Galilee. The one to the south is the Dead Sea. The river that flows between them is the Jordan River. And if you went there today, it would look something like this. John went out to the Jordan River. And Mark tells the story this way. So John the Baptizer appeared in the desert proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. So in Jerusalem, there was a whole institution and process and fees so that one person could have their sins forgiven by God. And John the Baptist saw all of it and said, nah, I don't think we need any of that. Let's go to the river and just wash water over ourselves and say, God washed away your sins. And as you can imagine, the people back in Jerusalem who had a vested economic interest in this system showed up to the Jordan River once John started getting a crowd around him. And they looked at him very nervously because he was threatening an economic structure that allowed the temple to continue to function. Now, they didn't want to say anything negative about John because John was clearly popular as he was baptizing the poor and baptizing people. So they just kind of sat there and looked at him nervously and hoped the problem would go away. In other words, the people from the temple showed up, they saw John baptizing people, and they just said, not comfortable, but I'm not going to say anything. 5 chapters later, we come across a man named Herod Agrippa, who is the king of Judea at this point. And Herod Agrippa suddenly just murders John the Baptist. And when people ask why, Herod Agrippa doesn't offer any explanation. He says, just felt like it, let's move on. And so there was all these state and religious structures that were participating in watching what John was doing, but they weren't really commenting or being transparent about why this all unfolded. And we talked about how Jesus was at some point, when he heard about John's death, devastated because he looked up to him as a mentor and as someone who was a leader in his own right in the Gospel of Mark. So here comes along Jesus. After starting this riot in the temple, the religious leaders ask him a question, and he says, I'm going to ask you a question first. Tell me, was John's baptism in the wilderness, was that of divine origin? Was God actually forgiving their sins? Or was it merely human? Was it just him washing water over human beings and it didn't mean anything? And you can see how Jesus here at this point is saying, like, what do you think? You all have not given us an answer for a very long time. We'd love to hear your thoughts on John's baptism. This caused a panic among the religious leaders. They met with themselves real quickly, and they kind of whispered to each other, if we say divine, then Jesus is going to ask, then why did you not put faith in it? AKA, why didn't you speak up when he was executed? Why didn't you do something about this if you think that he was a messenger from God? But then they said, can we say merely human? For they were worried about the people. They were afraid of them because they regarded John as a true prophet sent by God. So this is the conundrum the religious leaders are in. If they commit to one too much, it will cause problems either way. And so after their time together, they turn back to Jesus and they answer him and they say, "We do not know. We're not sure. We're going to take a pass on this one." And Jesus looks at them and in turn says to them, "Then neither will I tell you on what authority I do the things I do." And that is the end of the story. Now, this story reminds me of a story that happened what seems like forever ago now, but it was around a decade ago. And a lot can change in a decade, right? This was my wife and I at a recent date in Pioneer Town. About a decade ago, this is us on another date, and oh my goodness, I look so much older all of a sudden. My wife is still killing it, but man, I look way older. And I point this out because a lot changes in a decade, doesn't it? And over a decade ago, I was working at another church, and I was preaching on this passage that talked about heaven and eternal life and who was getting in and who was not. And during that sermon, I just talked about how we are going to be surprised that it is going to be way more people than we expected in heaven because God is more generous, loving, and inclusive than we possibly could be. I even suggested, I didn't say it outright, I hinted at that maybe God saves everyone. And this is called universalism, and it's considered heresy by a number of Christians and orthodoxy by a number of other Christians. Basically, to paraphrase, I said in this church that I used to work for, nearly everyone will be saved. And then Tuesday came around, and I got in trouble. I got reprimanded. I was told that this was inappropriate. I was told that I was being reckless with the religion that I was charged to lead people through. I was being told all sorts of things, that this was a problem and how I had created problems, and they started working on an apology process for me because they did not want me saying that nearly everyone will be saved. 1 week later, and I'm not kidding, this actually happened this way. There was a guy who we will call Kyle who showed up to our church, same church I was working at, right? And he was in administration at a local Christian school. And the local Christian school was hurting for enrollment, so they brought Kyle, this administrator, up on stage, and they did a Q&A session to talk about why parents should send their kids to a Christian school. And so the answer that Kyle gave was, he said, "Well, we all know the purpose of Christianity is to help us to get to the next life. And your kids will have a much better chance if they enroll at our Christian academy than if they make friends with worldly people." And so Kyle basically said, hardly anyone will be saved. The next Tuesday, with our leadership meeting, everyone was upset at what Kyle said. And they said, how could Kyle say this? This isn't inclusive, it isn't kind, it isn't loving. And I just sat there like, wait a second. What do we actually believe here? What is it? And the strangest thing happened. I found myself with respect for Kyle. I walked away from that meeting thinking, well, at least Kyle's willing to say something, because I got this sense that nobody wanted to say anything about what we actually believed when it came to heaven and salvation, because the answer might be unpopular. And so it's like the church was trying to walk this middle road where they could say, hey, we're not going to say anything about this. When in reality, their actions were asking a question, and this is a bit cynical, I will give you that. Can everyone please keep tithing? Just don't, let's not talk about it specifically, but let's keep this thing going, right? And it's very similar to this story that took place a long time ago, right? Jesus says, tell me an answer, take a stand, tell us where you are with John the Baptist. And the answer comes back, we don't know. And the subtext is, well, we just really want to keep the temple running, so could you just keep it down? We don't really want to answer that question. So the religious leaders come back and they say, we do not know. Now, we're telling the story in 2024. And in 2024, the world needs a lot more I don't know, right? Social media has all of a sudden made us experts on everything, and we're supposed to have an opinion on everything that we encounter, even though it usually crosses about 9 disciplines of rigorous academic work, right? Social media has taught us to beware of anyone who is an expert at everything, right? We don't need people to be experts on everything. We need you to be experts on a few things because we need experts that can tell us all of the nuances and complications of all the things that make human life what it is, right? And so we need a lot more people saying, I don't know, when questions are asked. And so while the religious leaders say we do not know, we should pause here and remind ourselves that it's okay when we say, I do not know, we do not know. However, there is one problem with that in applying it to this story. Who is Jesus talking to here? The experts, very good. He's talking to the chief priests, scribes, and elders. He's asking them a question about spirituality. He's speaking directly to the experts, and these guys are the experts. Imagine going to your doctor and saying, I want to live a healthy lifestyle. What should I be doing? And the doctor says, I don't know, just pray, I guess. These are the experts. And when you look at what a church is, a church should absolutely be an expert in something, which raises the question, what is that thing that we should be experts in as a community? Is it keeping our doors open? No, we should be experts in healthy spirituality. This is not limited to churches, it's all religious communities, right? Every religious community should be an expert on how to live a healthy spiritual life, right? And when you think about that and you apply that to this story and Jesus speaking directly to the experts, we realize that healthy spirituality cannot be found in vague answers. You can't find it. And Christianity is extremely guilty of this, right? So much so that an organization was founded not too long ago that I absolutely love. This organization is called Church Clarity, and you can go to their website and you can find verified, clear churches near you. Now, the tagline of Church Clarity is this: ambiguity is harmful, clarity is reasonable. Now, if you click around on their website, you will come across their mission statement, which is, our mission is to increase the standard of clarity throughout the church industry. We are not advocating for policy changes. We are standardizing church policy disclosure. Whatever the policy or type of church is in question, whatever the policy or type of church in question, people deserve to know the truth. So in other words, Church Clarity primarily focuses its work on gender equality as well as affirming churches, and their job is to figure out if the policy is transparent and obvious for everyone, so that way people who want to get involved in your church know up front what they can expect in regards to sexism and homophobia, right? Now, policy is very different, once again, than a social media post, right? There is a chasm between actions, policies, and practices and those social media posts. It is one thing to say we should pay everyone more. It is another thing to be an organization trying to pay people more when ends don't meet, right? And so here comes along Church Clarity, and their whole thing is like, look, you want to discriminate against women? That's your business. We just want you to be upfront about it. You want to say that being queer is a sin? Fine. Just say it up front so that way someone doesn't get involved in your church, says, I love it here, they are under the impression they're welcome to be there, and then they ask, can I be baptized? And everyone says, oh, wait, we got to talk about this. Imagine a woman walking into a church, participating in leadership for years, getting the right degrees, and then she says, I want to be a pastor, and they say, oh, we forgot to mention that. We actually don't ordain female pastors. And what Church Clarity says very clearly with their website and their actions is they are teaching us that a vague church is more damaging than a discriminatory church. A vague church is more damaging than a discriminatory church. This is something about 15 years ago I probably would have disagreed with, but I have found it to be true, and I found that it's been around for a lot longer than just 15 years. If you go back about 60 years ago, you come across one of the most important moments in all of American history when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech in August of 1963. Most every American knows about this speech. What most Americans don't remember or were never taught is that 4 months before this speech, Martin Luther King was locked in a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, because he was fighting for equal rights down south, right? And so he was in this jail cell. He was arrested on April 14, and then in April 15, a bunch of white pastors got together, and they wrote a letter, an open letter, to the newspaper that disavowed the methods of Martin Luther King. And they said, we believe in racial equality, but the way Martin Luther King is going about it is all wrong. And they united as white pastors of churches in that area, and they said, this has got to stop. He needs to recognize he's doing more harm than good. This infuriated Dr. King, so much so that he found scraps of paper all around his jail cell, and he wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail. And in my opinion, it's one of his greatest works there is. In that letter, he writes these words: I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner. It is instead the white moderate. Now, if you're wondering what a white moderate looks like, you're looking at him. He goes on to say, the white moderate is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a quote, and that's right from the white pastor's letter, a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Whew. He wrote this 4 months before I Have a Dream. And this causes me, as a white pastor, to hold up a mirror and ask myself, am I only offering lukewarm acceptance? Or am I willing to get uncomfortable to make things right? And when I come across this website of Church Clarity, which says a vague church is more harmful than a discriminatory church, this has some roots in it, right? It's not a new idea. It is decades old. And to be a vague church will always cause us to be more harmful than a discriminatory church. Which raises the question, why don't churches answer questions more? Why don't churches just answer what they believe? And they say, well, I think this is wrong and I think this is right. Why is it that they prefer to be vague on so many different topics? Well, the fact is, answers always open opportunities, but answers always trigger losses as well, right? If you want to stand up and say, we are an affirming church, you will lose people. If you stand up and you say, we ordain women and we believe in gender equality, you will lose people. If you say, we're committed to being an anti-racist church, you will lose people. You can gain people. You can get people to join you and be excited about those different directions that you pick, but you will only open yourself up to opportunities by allowing yourself to lose something, and that will always trigger losses. Now, with all of that in mind, this is where this story just gets brilliant. Because most churches or religious institutions would rather not answer things because they're scared to go ahead and lose something. Now, from a Christian perspective, we believe that Jesus Christ is the very embodiment of God. So if we take this metaphor as a full metaphor for what's teaching us about spirituality, we realize that there is something profound at the heart of the story. If you are unwilling to lose something, you will never hear the voice of God. If you are thinking to yourself, I don't want to risk it, I don't want to say anything controversial, Jesus would say, go ahead. You don't have to answer any question. But you, according to Christian tradition, will never hear the voice of God if you are scared to lose something. Which means that when we look at this life and what we're doing together, a question that we need to ask is, what are you or I afraid of losing? Because the fact is, we're going to lose it eventually, right? Nothing in this life is really forever. It's just here and now and what we have together. And while this may sound like a downer, the Christian tradition would say like, look, sometimes we do some buzzkills, we're sorry, but we have some good news. The good news is, if you go and you say to yourself, I'm not afraid of losing anything, you're gonna lose it, but if you do, you will hear the voice of God in the process of losing it. Mark is expecting you to read his gospel from cover to cover, and just 3 chapters before this one, Jesus says to a crowd, if you wish to come after me, you must deny your very self, take up your cross, and follow in my footsteps. If you would save your life, you'll lose it, but if you lose your life for my sake, you'll save it. If you are unwilling to lose something, you will never hear the voice of God. During this season of Easter, we are asking the question, how do we experience eternity now? And we can think about heaven as a theological concept, and one thing that we can think about as well, when I'm in heaven or when I'm part of eternal life, I'll be able to hear the voice of God clearly. So one way is by hearing the voice of God, right? So at this point, the question becomes, well, can we hear the voice of God now? Well, while some people might say they hear it concretely, others abstractly, you can ask each other this question. How have you heard the voice of God? And if you were to come over to my house and we were to have dinner together, and you were a friend that I built up a rapport with and I knew was someone who I could trust with a lot of my life experiences, I would give you a very different answer than you might expect. Because while I share a lot of my life on this stage with all of you wonderful people, there are some things that are so painful I cannot talk about them. But if you are one of my dearest friends, and we're over for dinner, and you ask me, hey, Craig, how have you heard the voice of God in your life? I would look at them and say, well, if you really want to hear me talk about God, then I'm going to tell you about what I've lost. And I would start to go in, and I guarantee I cry so easily, I would cry for the next 3 hours, right? But I would tell you about this because while I was growing up, I would learn a lot about God by doing things right. That stopped about 10 years ago, and now I only learn about God by doing things wrong. I wish it was easier to grow up. That's just my experience, right? So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what have I lost? What have you lost? Because the Christian tradition promises us that if we can answer that question, somewhere in that losing is the voice of God. Almost everyone here has been to a funeral of someone they have loved, right? And the more you love that person, the harder the funeral is, because the only reason funerals are hard is because we love. If you go to a funeral of someone you don't really know, you might say, oh, I feel bad for the people who are grieving this person, and I have empathy for all of them, but I wouldn't describe the funeral as hard, right? And what's sad about our society is that we often allow people to speak publicly about their tears and the grief they feel only at funerals. And to speak later, like a year later, 10 years later, 15 years later, is considered by our society to not be moving past it or not getting over it, right? And so last year, we started this tradition during the season of Easter when we're asking how can we experience eternity now. We started this tradition where we ask people to talk about the grief they're feeling for people who have passed away months ago, or a year ago, or years ago, or even a decade ago. And you know what we found? We have found that those tears are still fresh and still real. And those letters are hard for people to write, and they're hard to listen to, but at the same time, I think they are some of the most sacred words that have been uttered at this church. Because we have found that the voice of God is heard in the presence of loss. And I think these words that are shared today or shared in this series and this season are holy. We are honored in just a few moments to be able to hear a letter from Cheryl Garcia, who will also share the grief that she holds. And it is a sacred and holy process that we revere as a church together. And so when we look at this story, that seems to be a bit of a throwaway story because no one wants to be invested in an answer, it teaches us a lot about where God is and who God is and how we can hear the voice of God. And my hope is that this story will make it easier for you to answer among your friends and family what it is that you've lost. And as I look at the young people today who are still learning from all the positive experiences this life has to offer, I want to offer you a blessing as well as everyone else a blessing. To the younger folks, may you become an expert in something. This world needs experts, and so may you dedicate yourself to the field that you choose for study. Also, may you become bold enough to answer some of life's most difficult questions. May you also love with reckless abandon and give your heart away even when you have to say goodbye to someone. My friends, another blessing is may you transcend lukewarm acceptance and step into courageous action. May you have a community of love around you when you experience loss. And even in the heartache of loss, may you hear the voice of God. This is the promise of the Christian tradition, and I have found it to be true. May you find it to be true as well. Amen.